Hello, good evening, and welcome to The Watering Hole. My name is Jonathan Thomas. I'm pastor of Cornerstone Church in Abergavenny. And this year we've been getting together on YouTube once a month, roughly. We had a break over the summer, but once a month to interview different people about the way that God has been involved in their life and what God has done for them in their lives. And that's covered things like Oxford professors and professional footballers and different people. And this winter, we want to discuss issues of control and image, things about self-worth, and those kind of issues over the next couple of months. And so once a month here, the first Sunday of the month at 6 o'clock, we come together to have interviews. Now, this evening, I've got a good friend who's going to join us, Lydia Sibley. Lydia is a member of our church. She works locally and is married to James Sibley, who works for our church. And Lydia this evening is going to share her story with us of how she has encountered God, particularly through a difficult part of her life. But I'll let her explain that. Now, the way this evening works is I'm going to interview Lydia for about half an hour or so. And then after that interview, you can ask Lydia any question. So you can talk to her, ask questions about what she said, ask her to explain things, maybe go a little bit deeper, whatever issue you want to ask. And you can do that using something called Slido. Now, if you've never used it before, all you need to do is go on the internet. You can do that on your phone or your tablet or computer and go to Slido, and that's Slido. Or you can type in slido.com. And when you go there, as you can see on the screen, you just need to put this code in. If you put this code number in, then you'll come to a place where you can type in a question, and that will come through straight to us. So maybe take down those details now, find your way to Slido, and perhaps as the evening is going on, you can comment on Slido, you can post a question on Slido, and in about half an hour's time, we'll come back to those questions and do our best to try and answer all of those questions. But look, this evening isn't going to be about me talking, but rather it's going to be about Lydia Sibley talking. So Lydia, a warm welcome to you.
Thank you.
Now, for those perhaps who haven't met you before, could you let us know a little bit about who you are, where you come from, and what you're doing at the moment?
Yeah, so my name is Lydia. I live in Abergavenny and have done for the last 2 years or so. But I actually grew up in Cardiff, did all my growing up there, never really left until uni. I was born into a very, very happy, loving family. I've got 2 wonderful parents, 2 wonderful but annoying younger brothers who I love very much. So yeah, I haven't come from an extraordinary background. There's nothing like crazy about my family. Depending on how you view it, but I've come from a very loving home. And both my parents are Christians. I was brought up going to church and that being a very normal part of my life. But from a young age, my parents did try and help me to understand that just because they were Christians, that didn't mean that I was a Christian, and that it was something that they believed and felt was important, and so wanted to share with me, but that ultimately it came down to whether I believed that, and that's what would make me a Christian. So I had a very loving home, wonderful family, and was brought up going to church. And when you looked at me as a young kid, I probably didn't seem very extraordinary. I wasn't particularly abnormal at a young age. Yeah, there was nothing interesting about me up until a little bit later.
Well, I'm sure there was lots of interesting things about you, Lydia. But I mean, being brought up as you say in a loving Christian home, a stable home. I assume that means that you went through childhood and through your teenage years quite easily. Were those years a breeze for you, or how did those things work out?
Like the complete opposite. So I think that's why I want to make such a point that I came from a very normal background, because I think we have this idea of who these like types of things happen to, and I am not that. Like I was not pulled from pillar to post as a kid. Like I came from a very loving home, but that didn't matter when it came to my experienced growing up. So when I was maybe 11 or 12, as I said, my parents made it very clear that it was my decision as to whether I believed in God or not. And probably rough like 10 or 11, I would say, I probably came to the decision that I didn't believe in God, or that if God was there, that I didn't like him very much. So I wasn't planning on following him and giving my life to him in the way that my parents had. I had just seen things going on in my family's lives, in the lives of loved ones around me, within my friendship group, that I just thought, if there's a God who's all loving and all powerful, and my parents and my family have given up their lives to follow him, and these things that didn't seem particularly fair to me were happening, I just thought, well, that's not the type of God that I want to follow or believe in. And I came to the conclusion that I'd rather believe he didn't existed than believe that there was a God that was horrible. And so I kind of lived my life accordingly. I didn't tell my parents, just because when you're like 10 or 11, you don't want to have that argument with your parents as to why you think that their ideas are stupid. So I just let them crack on. I would still go to church with them, but I knew I didn't believe it. And because of that, I think I lost like what was quite a large part of my identity growing up. And I had turned my back on that being part of my life. And the things as well that I alluded to that I thought were unfair in my life made me feel this real sense of losing control of the situation. And I was a massive control freak. I think a lot of people saw it in me, but put it down to me being an older sibling and was just like, oh, it's just an older sibling thing. Nah, I was so controlling. I really, really felt safe when I was in control. So that, coupled with the fact that at about 12, 11, 12, I started becoming really aware of my body image. So I went to an all-girls school. I was surrounded by lovely, beautiful young ladies, and it's not their fault that they were stunning, but I hated that they all seemed to have like this perfectly together image. And I was very aware that I didn't. And I think lots of us feel that way. And those people that I was looking up to and being incredibly jealous of probably felt the same way about everybody else that they were surrounded by. But I looked around and saw these stunning young girls, and I just wasn't that. Um, I was definitely still carrying that like puppy dog weight that lots of people find cute and endearing when you're like 5, but when you're 11 or 12, actually you feel really awkward about it. And I just felt really out of place. It meant that I ended up trying way too hard to make friends and fit in. It probably ended up coming across as being really weird and like too keen, which made the problem like all so much bigger. And because I ostracized myself by my behavior of like being very clingy and being very controlling once I had made friends. And that then was kind of the perfect storm to the situation that I then found myself in. Now, that's not to say that every insecure, controlling young girl is going to end up controlling the way she eats, but that is what happened for me. I can't say exactly when it started, mainly because the thought processes were there long before the outward actions, but I did start obsessing over what I was eating, how I was eating, when I was eating. And soon it became that I just wouldn't eat, which is quite difficult actually, like really sustaining not being able to eat. I think a lot of people think that with an eating disorder you just suddenly stop eating and then you get really skinny and you get really unwell, but actually it started by just controlling what I ate at lunchtime, because now I was in big school, the teachers like babysat you when you ate. So I would have a little bit of breakfast, and I would say I was quite full when I got home from school, but I would still eat dinner, but I would really minimize what I was eating at school. And it just gradually got like so much worse. And that continued for quite a long time. It wasn't until I was 16 that I really saw that there was an issue in my behavior. But because it's so slow and so gradual, all of a sudden you're in a position you think, how on earth have I got here? What has happened to me? But I never got particularly really skinny to the point where people were really concerned about me. In fact, I think one of the dangers of people developing eating disorders is that, especially if you carried a little bit more weight like I did at the start, people start complimenting you, your weight loss is inspiring. People are like, oh wow, what's your secret? And I was just like, oh, I'm just exercising more. Like, no, I wasn't. I was starving myself, but it was um, seen as being a really good thing that I had lost weight. And I remember feeling really powerful, like in control of the situation. And the thing with an eating disorder is that you will always feel in control of it. So whilst I look back and know that I was completely controlled by my eating disorder, at the time it was something that made me feel secure. So there were these, my eating disorder was kind of framed by these periods of like completely not eating or eating very, very little, and then going on this big binge, maybe like 2 weeks, every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks. And I would slowly but surely like store things up from my parents' kitchen and hide them in my room. And then I would completely let go. And in my head, that was me going crazy, like losing control, eating everything. I could I could get through so much food, and I would then keep all those wrappers, and that would be a reminder of how much I then couldn't eat for the next however many weeks. So my parents were like completely unaware of this at this point. Like I said, I was never skinny enough that people noticed and thought, wow, she looks unwell. Mainly because I was doing all this binging as well and wasn't getting rid of it straight away. So I was having those calories in my body. And I think the only thing that my parents knew was that they would sometimes find those wrappers and either thought I was secret eating or was just like, why can't this teenager throw her rubbish away? Why is it all in her room? But yeah, I was very, very good at hiding it because why would I want anyone to take away my control? And it was all about feeling so in control. But then roughly 15, 16, I started realizing I was completely out of control. Um, I don't really know how to describe it other than if you like imagine you were in one of those like blow up raft things in the sea, and you're like in the raft and you're enjoying yourself and you feel fine, you feel in control. And half an hour goes by and all of a sudden you look up and you're like being swept out to sea, and you wake up and you're like, how have I got here? And that's what it felt like. All of a sudden, like those years are a blur. There are some parts that I barely remember, but I remember thinking, what am I doing? Like, I am not in control of this anymore. I think it was probably towards the end when I started dabbling in drugs to keep myself going, to give me that energy that I needed without eating, that I really thought, oh wow, this is bad. Like, what are you doing to yourself? But just as in that situation where you're then out in the middle of the ocean, what do you do except cling to the raft that you're in even more? And that was me. Like I knew it was wrong. I had woken up to the fact that I was not in control and I knew it was wrong. But I didn't know what else to do because letting go of it would let go of every ounce of control I thought I had. So that was kind of me at 15, 16, really, really struggling to work out where I go from here because I really didn't want to tell my parents. Like I knew that they would take some sort of responsibility or blame on themselves, and I didn't want them to feel that way. I still felt somehow that I could clean up my own mess, that I could be in control of the thing that had completely taken control of me. So that yeah, I really didn't say a way out of it. I genuinely thought that I was just going to be stuck in this cycle, and that yes, I could try slowly introducing food back into my life healthily. There were kind of practical things I could do, but this cycle of needing control it and having this relationship with food, I didn't see ever going away. And it was then that I ended up in a church service and actually paying attention for the first time in a very long time, because as I said, I had completely disregarded God as being a real thing. But the guy who was preaching was the pastor of my church back in Cardiff. And I couldn't tell you what the service was about, couldn't tell you what he preached on, wasn't really paying that much attention. But I just remember something sticking out to me when he said about, like, what are you looking for? Like, what do you need? What are you looking for? And I was just thinking, well, if I knew that, this whole control thing would be a lot easier, because at least I would know where to direct myself. And he said a lot of things that were really, really helpful. But one of the things that he said a little bit later on, because I was zoning in and out, was about how we have this picture in our heads that when we follow God, like, your life will all of a sudden become this pristine and perfect thing, which is 10 or 11, that's the expectation I had, and why I turned my back on him. But that is not what the Bible promises. That's not what the Bible says your life will be like as a Christian. But the Bible does promise that there is a God who loves you, and there is a God who knows everything about you. And that really struck me, because I, quite frankly, was surrounded by people who knew nothing about me, not because it was their fault, but because I was a great secret keeper. But suddenly I was confronted that there was someone who knew everything about me and loved me regardless and wanted me anyway. And that was really, really powerful for me, that there could be someone who wanted me as I was, completely damaged, completely broken, obsessed with control, but that he would want me anyway. And I was also confronted with the fact that I did things wrong, that I wasn't perfect. And I think a lot of the time I blamed my behavior and my actions on being unwell. But actually, I realized there were things that I had done in my life that I had chosen to do that hurt other people, that I knew were wrong. There were things that I had done that I was ashamed of, and that God would forgive me for that. And that actually he took that forgiveness so seriously, and that love for me so seriously, that his son Jesus died for me, lived a perfect life for me, and died for me so that I could be forgiven. And that for me was completely outrageous, and it's something I had heard growing up, but at that point it made sense, and it was the only thing that made sense out of this, like, craziness that I got myself involved in. So I became a Christian then. I knew that I needed God, and it changed my life. It really did.
I mean, it's what, 3-4 years of struggling and kind of having, in a sense, rejected God, but not showing people you'd rejected him, trying to control things and gain control. And then God, through a church, reveals himself to you in a sermon. I mean, I guess everybody wants to meet God in one way or another, and often we think of people having these experiences. People will talk about a road to Damascus experience, going back to Paul in the Bible, a kind of blinding light that changes everything. So for you, was that it? Was it 3 or 4 years of struggle? You meet God, bang, and now everything is good. Did kind of you wake up the next day and it was all good?
No. So it was definitely like a bang. God is real, and God is amazing, and that Jesus has died to save me. That was definitely a big bang moment in my life, but it didn't get easier overnight. Like, those thoughts were still, like, gripping me. I couldn't suddenly just eat again. Like, food made me feel uncomfortable. Like, even just being around food at that point, when I wasn't prepared to be around it, so when I hadn't designated myself that time to eat, just being around food was uncomfortable. And like, the feeling of eating was horrible. And it's so strange to me now, because I love food, so like, the fact that the process of eating was so uncomfortable for me at the time is kind of, yeah, it feels weird now. But it did continue to be not great. I think it continued for longer than necessary, because I didn't ask for help properly. I was still naive and thought that I could control my recovery. And ultimately, God was very good to me, and I did recover, but it took a long time, probably a good year and a half, before I could eat a meal, like, at every meal time. But I did eventually get there. I had a couple of really good friends who found out, not because I told them, but because they noticed, and started babysitting me as I ate food, because they were particularly concerned about me. But yeah, I did get there. My mindset changed. I think that was the main thing. So the controlling behavior didn't change, but my mindset of who I was and what I was worth really, really changed, which did help that process of recovery. But it was a long road. It wasn't an instant thing at all. And I took a gap year before uni. I was not prepared to, like, emotionally to go to uni. So on my gap year, I actually worked in my church's coffee shop, and I volunteered there 3 days a week. And the manager there, Maddie, she probably doesn't even know like how much of an influence she had over my recovery. But having someone who I spent a lot of time with, who had actually looked after me on camps as a kid, but wasn't that much older than me, was a great role model. Just having someone to speak to me like a normal human being who believed in Jesus was amazing. The majority of my friends up until this point still weren't Christians. I found it really hard to connect with other Christians because of everything that was going on in my life, and I still didn't feel able to open up and share with them. And outwardly, my behavior probably looked worse than pre being a Christian, because I was not trying to hide how crazy my life had become. And so I was finding it really hard to connect with other Christians at the time. But having someone who was a Christian who I could connect with, who I could share my faith with openly, because a lot of my friends wouldn't be okay with me talking about it, and it was quite like an awkward part of my life. She had such a massive impact over me, and we would be like mopping the floor but talking about how amazing God is. And one of the conversations I remember having with her was about God being capable of being in control. And whilst I theoretically knew this, I think even up until this point I hadn't like acted like it was true. So I was still clinging on to the fact that I could be in control. I could be in control of my recovery. I could still have like pockets of control. Sure, I'll give God the big things because who wants the big things, but I'll do the small things because I'm capable. And I wasn't capable of doing those things. So yeah, it was at that point in that conversation that I started to realize that if I truly believed in God, if I truly believed that Jesus died for me, I need to live like that. And I need to give over my control to the one it belongs to, the God who created everything, the God who sustains everything, and the God who is perfect and loves me perfectly, and that I could trust with that. I feel like up until that point, I had such issues trusting other people to have control, whereas I could trust God with that. And so that made such a huge difference to me that year. With Maddie in the coffee shop really helped me and set me on a good path when I went off to university then. And at uni, that was the first time I felt like I could share my experiences with people, mainly because people at home knew me during the time. I think it's always different telling people who knew you but didn't know those things about you compared to those people who know you afterwards. So I was a little bit more open about it at university. It made me really keen to share what Jesus had done for me. It made me really keen to invite people to get to know Jesus for themselves. Because whether you've struggled in the way that I have or struggled in different ways, Jesus is relevant to your life. I firmly believe that. You don't need to have gone through an eating disorder to need Jesus. And it made me really passionate about sharing the good news that the Bible shares with other students. So I got really involved in the CU, and that's when I had opportunities to help other people who were struggling like me. And it really made me think for the first time, like, God's given me this experience to share. So I did eventually get better.
Yeah.
And yeah, I've been able to slowly but surely remember to give control to him. And it's not something that necessarily will go away. I will probably always be a little bit more controlling than most people that you meet. My poor husband will probably tell you that. But I know now that control is not my place. It's not mine to have, and it shouldn't be mine to have.
And Lydia, that's really helpful. And perhaps later on we can unpack a little bit about other ways control can manifest itself in our life, and perhaps different seasons of life, and how we we work through that. But I'm really keen to ask you a question. You know, you kept a lot of this to yourself. You said one or two friends figured out what was happening, and you know, Maddie in the coffee shop, unbeknowing to her, was very helpful. But kind of looking back at maybe 15-year-old Lydia, if you could kind of hop in the time machine and kind of tell her anything in terms of what to do and where to get help, what would you say?
I would say stop hiding things. People will still care about you just because you're damaged. So I would say your friends are 16. They don't know what they're doing, bless them. They have no idea. They're really worried about you, and get some proper help. And there are some great things out there to actually support people with eating disorders. So first point of call is going to your GP, like talk to your doctor. Your doctor is trained to look after you, not just your like bones and your organs, but your brain, and the way that your brain can sometimes become dysfunctional. They are trained to help you. Your 16-year-old mate is not. So first and foremost, go and get some real help. But also, if you're struggling to access that type of help, sometimes the waiting list can be really long. And sometimes you're just too scared to go to your GP. It can be really intimidating. There's also some great charities out there. So for example, there's a charity called Beat, who help people with eating disorders, but they also help friends and family of people who are suffering. So if you're watching this because you know someone who's struggling and you don't know what to do, I would recommend talking to them, because they can really help you. Because it's a difficult position to be in, supporting someone who's struggling just as much as it can be when you're struggling. So there are plenty of things out there for help. I know that's easy for me to say now. An eating disorder is in its nature very secretive, because you want to be in control of it, and by telling other people you feel like you'll lose that control. But recovery starts with those little battles of giving up control to someone else. So yeah, I would say get some real help, because I probably could have recovered a lot quicker if I had done that.
Yeah, and you know, I think that's a really important point. And you know, listening to your story, and you know, at what point someone really realizes they have an eating disorder, or admits that to themselves, is difficult. But you know, it would seem to me the earliest, you know, even when you're worried you have an eating disorder, and you're not perhaps even happy to quantify it as that, probably is worth talking to someone and getting help, your GP or Beat, as you said. I think that's a great thing to do. So if you are watching this this evening and you are struggling, then please make that phone call. That's really, really important. Lydia, let's talk a little bit about control, because you kept coming back to that. You know, this was trying to take control of your life, trying to have something in your life that you could control. And I guess we're living through a global pandemic at the moment. You know, I really feel for people across the border. And you may be watching this evening and you're in England, and you know, 2 days ago, you know, life was just going on, and you knew it was going to be a tough winter, but it was just going on. And now, you know, you're going into lockdown, and so, you know, we're all losing control of our freedom. Some people perhaps losing business or wage. Some people not being able to visit loved ones who are perhaps growing old or are terminally ill. All of these issues of control. And I guess at this season of kind of global history, it would be tempting to try and take control. So having gone through what you've been through, what can we do when we feel out of control and we want to try and control, perhaps through an eating disorder, or drinking alcohol, or perhaps manipulating someone, or it could be just, you know, being super healthy or whatever. What kind of things can we do in those situations?
Yeah, I guess the main thing is to acknowledge that where that desire for control comes from. So I don't think that desire for control necessarily points to a bad thing. So I personally, as a Christian, so I believe that God created the world with order and purpose. And we're designed to live in order and purpose rather than complete chaos. And so when things feel chaotic, it's only natural that we want things to have order, and we look to ourselves to control that and to give ourselves that order, and that's where this need for us being in control comes. We believe that we are the ones who can get that order back, and yeah, I think that can kind of come from two places. It can come from fear, and it can come from pride, or it can come from a mixture of the two. So the fear of what's going on around you, the fear of this situation, the fear of losing your job, the fear of getting sick, the fear of not being able to be with loved ones, the fear of isolation, the fear of being anxious if you know that that's what you're prone to, which in turn probably leads you to end up feeling more anxious. And those fears drive us to take control of that situation and make ourselves feel safe. Also, our pride comes into this. None of us like to admit that we're proud, but we all think that we're the best people to control the situation. We all think that we know best. And we've probably proved to ourselves multiple times that we don't. We would all openly admit that we're not perfect, that we are flawed, we're only human. Like, that's what you'll hear people say when we make mistakes. We're only human. And you're perfectly right. You are only human. And so normally when you take control, it's not going to be perfect. And that doesn't mean that it becomes any easier to let go of that control. It's just the facts. But as a Christian, I firmly believe that there is a God who deserves that control, who is much bigger than any of us, who, as I said before, created and sustains the world that we live in. And whilst we may not understand what he's doing, and there'll be times where you disagree. I think lots of Christians don't want to admit that you disagree with whatever God is doing because you don't get it. Like, why? That doesn't mean that we're right and that he's wrong. It just means that we disagree. And I know that even at those times where I disagree, I firmly believe that God knows what he's doing. And that if I knew everything that God knew, which I definitely don't, I wouldn't do it differently. And so that's kind of helping the thought process. But that only helps if you believe in God, right? That only helps if you have a belief that, like I do, that there is a God that loves you and wants the best for you. And if that's not you, if you're watching and that isn't you, and you think, well, that's all well and good for you, but I don't know what you're talking about, I would say look into it. I would say don't just leave this thinking, well, that was completely irrelevant for me because I don't share her beliefs. I would say you're here listening to this, so why not have a look at what I'm saying? Why not open the Bible? Why not meet the God that I say is true, and that lots of other people say is true? It's not just me. And have a look at who Jesus is. So if you've never read the Bible before, it's split into two sections, Old and New Testament. Pop to the New Testament, and the first 4 sections are eyewitness accounts of Jesus's life. So why don't you give them a read and see if any of that makes sense to you? And if it doesn't, chat to a Christian friend, get in touch with the church here. We'd be more than happy to go through that with you. But the only real hope, and I say this because the only real hope that I can offer is being able to give control to someone who earns it and deserves it and is more than capable of taking control of the situations you find yourself in. And there are a couple of practical things that you can do. So I find it really helpful to write down the lists of worries that I have that I thought were going to trigger my behavior, my controlling behavior, and I would pray through that, and I would give that control to God. Didn't necessarily mean that by midday I wasn't trying to control the situation, but I was trying. And like I said, we're not perfect. We won't perfectly be able to give up control, but I found that particularly helpful when I was really, really struggling, to write those things down and acknowledge that I was not in control of those situations. And it really helped kind of dissuade the fear that I felt over those things. But ultimately, the only thing I've got to offer is Jesus. That's all I've got.
And you see that happening in, you talk about those first 4 sections of the New Testament. The second one, Mark's Gospel, which I guess is the shortest life of Jesus, is a really pacey read. In the first few chapters of Mark's Gospel, you've got all of these accounts of Jesus being in situations where people are out of control, and he shows his control. And one of the most famous ones is he's in a boat with a pile of kind of hardened fishermen. They live in their boats. They know exactly what they're doing. And a massive storm comes, and, they try their hardest to kind of deal with it and to get on top of the storm. And in the end, they come to the point when they realize there's nothing they can do. And I always find it amazing because they wake Jesus up, who's a carpenter. So you're like, if you're in a storm and you're a fisherman, the last thing you need is a carpenter. But they come to that point when they realize they're not in control. And when they call Jesus this carpenter, they clearly believe he can do something more. And they clearly have an issue with the fact that he hasn't done anything about it. Because when they wake him up, they say, Jesus, don't you care if we drown? Don't you care? And I think that kind of encapsulates that kind of experience of 11 to 15, isn't it? If life is out of control, does God care? Because surely if God is good, then everything will be okay. But what you've shown us here is, really the reality of life is actually these things do happen, but God is still good. He does care. And as you said earlier on, the real reason we know he cares is because he stepped into our world and he's died for us. And he is in control. I mean, in that account in the storm, he literally talks to the waves and the wind, and they calm down, and the fishermen panic, and they kind of go, who is this? He can control even the wind and the waves. And so I agree, if you're watching this, read Mark's Gospel, contact us. We'd love to help you know about that. Someone who has gone through kind of similar journey, different but similar, is a lady called Emma Scrivener. And she's written 2 books which kind of cover this in more detail. And so if you do want to go off and read more about this, I'd encourage you to do these 2 books. And one is called A New Day, Grace and Healing for Anorexia. The other one talks about moving on from hunger, anxiety, control, shame, anger, and despair. And so we really would encourage you, if you want to read more about these things from a Christian perspective, read someone else's life story, then these 2 books by Emma Scrivener are well worth looking at. Well, look, Lydia, people have been sending in questions, so that's really good. And everybody back home, I'd encourage you, if you want to ask Lydia any question, then please send that in on Slido now. You can see the details just below me there, but we've got some good questions. But as we come ready to prepare those questions, we'll give Lydia a 2-minute break, and we thought we would play you a song which is sung by some of the folk from our church. It's a favourite song in our church that really has the cry, Lord, I need you, and kind of sums up the way we see life and our need of the Lord. So why don't you sit back and enjoy this song?
I find my rest, and without you stand or fall on you. Jesus, you're my hope and stay. Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you. Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you.
Well, a warm welcome back to the watering hole. If you've been kind of joining us for the last kind of 20 minutes or so and you missed the start, my name's Jonathan Thomas. I'm pastor of Cornerstone Church in Abergavenny, and this is an online meeting that we do once a month, interviewing people about how God has embraced them in their life, how they have experienced God. And this evening we've been interviewing Lydia Sibley about her experience of God in the midst of an eating disorder. And so now it's over really to everybody watching to ask questions. As I said, you can go to Slido just below and you can bring your questions in. We've got some good questions here, really helpful. So Lydia, I'll ask you the question and answer as you think you can. A good question here. What advice would you give parents who might suspect the child has an eating problem and or knows their child is struggling with an eating disorder?
It's a very good question. I like to start it by saying I'm not a parent, and I'm not a parent who has been in that situation. I've definitely seen it from the other perspective, but I think the best thing you can do is try and keep a very open dialogue with your child. So if you can see that they're struggling with something, it's probably really scary for you as a parent. Again, like, I don't know how you're feeling, but I'm assuming it's very, very scary to watch your child go through something like that. And sometimes when we're scared, that can lead us to back away or switch off or do the complete opposite and become incredibly overbearing. And you want to be able to find the balance of the two. Now, you're not perfect. You'll probably do either or and switch between the two extremes, but keeping that dialogue open with your child so that they have the opportunity to talk to you about it, but also in a loving way. You can broach being concerned about them. You don't need to necessarily say, I'm concerned that you're not eating. I feel like that's very forthright. But it's trying to explain that you're concerned that they don't view themselves as wonderfully as you see them, or making sure that they understand that their worth and who they are is not bound up in the way that they look. I think we as a society have a very unhealthy relationship towards weight. How often do you hear people say, oh, I want to be skinnier instead of I want to be healthier, as if the two things are mutually exclusive? Being skinny doesn't mean that you're healthy. And I think it's about helping your child see that there's being healthy and being a nice normal weight, and then there's being unhealthy and being skinny because you're depriving your body of things that it needs. And so I think those are the things you can try and bring in and build into conversation with them. But if that is you, obviously we don't know who you are because it's anonymous, and that's absolutely fine. But just know that myself and the church here will pray for you. Like we don't want you to feel like you're alone in that situation. So we will be praying as a church family that anyone who's struggling or is helping someone who is struggling will find real help in that.
And again, I think we referred to Beat earlier on, isn't it? And I guess that is a charity again, that people can people can access. You know, as a parent of young children, you know, again, so there's an element of lack of knowledge as I say this, but part of parenting, and maybe the most difficult part of parenting, is creating an environment of unconditional love, where a child does know that actually whatever it is, they can say it, and not just creating an environment of unconditional love, but an environment of time. Sometimes people know they can say something, but they don't have the time to say it because it takes so much courage to say it. But I do think as well, it is worth noting, you know, sometimes I think parents think they have more control over their children than they do. That is, that everything in their children's life is a direct reflection of them. So that, you know, any problems their child has is the parent's problem. But actually, you know, parents, when our children struggle, particularly with this, doesn't necessarily mean that there's been something in the parenting. And I think, you know, parents sometimes can struggle with really unhelpful kind of guilt there. And I think this all comes back to what you've been saying in the big point, Lydia, is even for parents now there are issues of control. So can I control my child's future, my child's health, my child's mental health? And actually even there needs to be a point where you say, no, I can't. As a young parent, you know, that the first time you have a baby, one of the scariest things in the world is when they sleep in a cot on their own, because you're kind of literally watching them for every second, and then you've got to go to sleep. So what's going to happen when you sleep? You can't do anything for them anymore. And one of the wonderful things of the Bible is it tells us that God neither slumbers nor sleeps. And actually we can sleep because he doesn't sleep. We can give up control because he's in control. But yeah, Lydia, that's very helpful for parents. What about friends? You talked about friends who kind of notice things and babysat you as you ate. Someone's asked this question. Lydia, how would you speak the truth in love to someone in your church family or a friend who you suspect is struggling with an eating disorder?
Yeah, that's a really helpful question. Just even the way you phrased it, speaking the truth in love is incredibly important. First and foremost, like, it can be really difficult to do this if you don't have a relationship with that person. So if up until this point you haven't been interested is probably like a harsh way of saying it, but if you haven't been involved in that person's life, you'll probably find it more difficult to be able to speak into something like this, just because of the nature of an eating disorder and how secretive it is and how attacked you can feel when someone starts talking about that. So I would say, first and foremost, build up. If you don't have that relationship already, it might feel like you're wasting time when you want to talk to them about something that's so important, but actually build up a relationship with that person where you can speak into their life with love. And I think one of the things as well is being able to say that you're concerned about something, knowing that they will probably tell you that you're wrong. Knowing that they'll probably tell you to go away, and knowing that there is a risk that they will stop wanting to confide things in you. You have to be aware that if that happens, it's not an attack against you. That person is very defensive. It's a natural thing when you're dealing with any kind of mental health, that they want to hide it and deny it. I think the best thing to do is lead by saying that no matter what they answer you with, no matter where the conversation leads, that you love them, that you care for them. You're only bringing this to them because you are worried, and that no matter how the conversation is left, you will be continuously praying for them. I think opening up with a premise of no matter how you react, I will still love you and care for you and be here for you will really help bring up some openness to the conversation. But yeah, it's a really good question, and it's really difficult. If that person is not at a place where they're ready or willing to get help, you can't control that, and you can't save them. You are not God. You can't save that person from themselves. And whilst that's a horrible thing to know. Again, it goes back to this issue of control. You're not in control, but you can be used to do really good and important things in that person's life. So don't let that dissuade you from having the conversation, but don't blame yourself if the conversation doesn't go as well as you hope it does.
And sometimes people, in different situations, be it an eating disorder or perhaps being in a place of difficulty, sometimes people aren't ready to talk, but that doesn't mean that they won't talk at some point. And I guess it's having that ability to continue in friendship, and that kind of that kind of unjudgmental kind of support, so that when people are ready to talk, that they know that they can talk to you, which is really helpful. There's an interesting question here, and a helpful question, and maybe we can unpack it a bit. How do you balance seeking secular help like Beat and approaching the issue from a biblical spiritual perspective? Have you got any thoughts on that?
So it's a really good question, and I think regularly we don't strike the right balance. I think we tend to land in the two extremes. So we either think just go and get medical help and it will fix all your problems, or you would land in the other extreme where you think pray about it and it'll go away. You don't need any medical help. Both are wrong, I think. To say that your brain cannot be broken in the same way that your leg can be broken is incorrect. We live in a world where things are not perfect anymore. And so your brain can become unwell, your thought processes can be broken, and there is proven medical help there. So I don't want us to be ignorant to the fact that those things work, and there's evidence for those things working. But as you could probably tell through my story, the spiritual was a massive part of that. So being able to give up control to a God who I know I can trust control with has been a huge part of my recovery. And praying and having other people pray for me when I've been struggling has been a massive, massive help. I think the two need to come hand in hand. And unless you are certified to give medical help, don't do it. It's not your place to do it. So point them in the direction of medical help, understand that that's good for that person who's struggling, really encourage them to do that. And then you, as a Christian friend or family member, come alongside and pray with them, and show them the love that Jesus has shown them. Because sometimes you can't see that for yourself when you're struggling. And this is not just with an eating disorder, but any mental health issue. It tends to cloud the love of Jesus. You can't see it for yourself. And it makes such a difference when you can. So you as a Christian friend or family member, that's your place to encourage in that, and that's the church's place to encourage in that. But you shouldn't dissuade them from getting medical help for their eating disorder.
I wonder sometimes whether with these kind of questions, a change of language helps. So I found a number of years ago that when I used the word balance, in my mind, I was then limiting both. So my worry was always I would do too much of one because I want to balance. So I don't want to give too much medical help because then that will affect the spiritual, or I don't want to give too much spiritual help because that will affect the medical. And so a number of years ago, I actually decided not to use the word balance anymore. And I started talking about a holistic approach. And so because we are, physical, mental, spiritual beings, and all of those interconnect, which is phenomenal, that actually when I advise people now who come to see me, about perhaps depression or anxiety, I don't want to have to decide and limit how much medical help they get and how much spiritual help they get. I want to say, go for both and get as much as you can. Just get as much as you can of both. Because actually, once you take away the concept of balance and it's holistic, it's a different world. So I've been in situations where someone is seeing a counsellor every week and I'm praying with them every week. Now, I'm not going over everything they discuss with a counsellor. That's what the counsellor is doing, but I'm praying with them. And there's no reason why God can't mix these things. So theologians, I'm not a theologian, but apparently theologians will talk about common grace and special grace. And so special grace is what, he's done through his son, the Lord Jesus, and prayer and church. That's, a kind of specific grace. But then there's common grace, this good things that he's given common to everybody in the world, which would include doctors and nurses and, people working in social services and the charity sector. And so actually, I think it's helpful sometimes to see kind of secular help, not as secular, but as common grace, and to see it going together. But a really good question, and thank you for the person who's asked that. Got a little bit coming back to family members, and another question, if we can. Did you seek support from family members? The question asks. I went through something similar, and my mum, who's a Christian, spotted these signs.
So honest answer is no, I didn't. That doesn't mean it was the right thing to do. I just want to reiterate, we've heard about my experience, but my experience isn't the right thing or the wrong thing. It's just what happened in my life, and I want to be honest about it. I hid it very purposefully from my family. I was extremely worried that they would feel guilty, and I probably bore that burden far more than I should have, worried about it far more than was necessary. I didn't speak to them about it, which is, looking back, completely outrageous. They're both medical professionals. Why did I not do that? But that's the honest situation. I didn't talk to them about it until I took on my gap year. I became quite worried during the year, and there was one point where I did actually feel like I was unwell. So I didn't stop eating or anything like that, but just the urges of that type of control were coming back up. And so I did say to my mum that I had struggled with it, didn't really open up particularly about it, didn't say very much, mainly because my mum is very good, and I don't have to say very much for her to know what's going on. And at that point, she knew a little bit, but it was only recently that I really told my parents properly what I went through, just because it doesn't need to be hidden. It's not a secret. I'm literally sharing about it on YouTube, so they do know about it. But I think it's amazing that you were able to open up to your mum about it and that she was able to spot those signs. But again, everybody's story ends up being different. So no, I didn't do that.
And I think it is worth mentioning, as we time's nearly up, Lydia, it's flown by. But it is worth saying, I think, as well, to parents who perhaps do suspect that something's happening or a child has opened up to them. I think it's really important, just as we're telling everybody who's struggling with this to seek help, actually for them to seek help too, to get advice. How do we create a home environment that's going to help my child to get through this? And again, it's that holistic approach to make sure that as parents, we are accountable to someone else who can help us through that. Lydia, our time's gone. We could have asked more questions, and there's some other questions that are really helpful, but I would encourage people, please contact us as a church if you want any more help, if there's anything we can do to serve you. We've also got other editions of The Watering Hole that you can look on our YouTube page and see, that discuss other questions. There's a great interview with an Oxford professor about suffering and the coronavirus. There's an interview with a couple of ex-professional football players about how they've met God and what God does for them now in their life. There's another one about how do we pray to God when we're struggling. So we'd encourage you over to the YouTube page there. And as well, an invite in a month's time, we'll be back the first Sunday in December. I've got a gentleman coming in who was a professional rugby player and then met Jesus, and how that changed his life. And what does it mean to be an elite athlete and to struggle with issues of identity and image and needing to succeed and prove yourself. And so that'll be in a month's time, and we'd love to see you there. But Lydia, thank you so much for being so honest. One person said in the comments that it was inspiring, and I really do think it was, so thank you very much. And to everybody who's watched, thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you next time. Goodbye.